In episode 6, it is the first day of the Dodson trial, and the prosecution gets up there and makes their opening statement, and it's a long one. But when Perry gets up there to make his opening statement, he freezes up, completely bombing it. That night, Pete, Perry, and Della get together in Perry's home/office, and Perry mentions how he's got this whole script laid out, and when they practice it, he's fine, but when he gets up there, he just bombs. Della mentions how there's so much stuff that the prosecution is mentioning that's just not true, and if they look into it more, they can prove it. And they're going to send Pete out to investigate some of this stuff, while also tasking Pete with trying to find a connection between Ennis and the kidnappers. Day 2 of the trial, Perry does way better. Matthew Dodson is on the stand, and the prosecution tries to paint Emily as an adulterer who conspired to kidnap her own child. When Perry cross-examines, he paints Matthew Dodson as a liar, lying to Emily about why they were moving out to California, lying to the cops about where he was that night. And his cross-examination gets Matthew Dodson so upset that he comes unraveled on the stand, questioning if he's even the father of baby Charlie, and then yelling at Emily that he hopes that she dies. Day 3, though, the prosecution calls this witness to the stand that Perry knew nothing about. And even though he objects to it, the judge allows it. And Perry turns to Emily and says, "Do you even know this guy?" And she says, "No, I don't think so." But the witness is a hotel manager that remembers Emily Dodson and George Gannon checking in and getting 2 adjoining rooms. And when he walked by it, he heard Emily and George having sex, but in the next room, he heard a baby crying. And when he went in, baby Charlie was just sitting on the bed, bawling his eyes out. And it's not a great picture of Emily. And when Perry visits Emily that night, he rips into her, because all she said was that it was love letters and a few kisses here and there, nothing like this. And that story makes her look terrible to everybody in the courtroom, because the way they see it, if she was willing to leave baby Charlie on that bed while George and her had sex, then maybe she was willing to let George kidnap her own child. He yells at her, "That's why you have to give me all the information so I'm adequately prepared." As he's leaving, he runs into Sister Alice and the two have a quick chat, but Perry lets her know, "Don't come to court. I know you think you're helping, you're not." So Perry's had a pretty rough day, and he heads back to his home/office where he sees Pete and Della going through a ton of boxes. And he asks, "What the hell is this?" And Della says, "Well, when you accuse the district attorney of not handing over all the evidence, they sent all of the evidence. And they put a ton of red herrings in a bunch of boxes. So they have to sift through all of it to try to find out what's pertinent to the case." They did, however, get a very small tip about one of the kidnappers being rented a room during the same period that Ennis lived in Denver. But that tip isn't enough to change Perry's mood, so he walks outside to get some air when Pete follows him, because Pete headed over to George Gannon's house after the prosecution mentioned this phantom garage that doesn't exist. But then he saw George Gannon's mail that had just been delivered, and something piqued his interest. And he hands him 2 uncashed checks from the church made out to some company that just so happened to be addressed to George Gannon's residence. And he's pretty sure that George was stealing from the church, but the checks are signed by Elder Seidel, so they are legit. He then gives Mason some advice, because Officer Drake is set to take the stand the next day, so Pete tells him, use the dentures, screw the cop. You have a duty to your client to get her off, and you know that that can help. But this leaves Mason with a moral conundrum. Does he use the teeth and break his promise to Drake, or does he not use the teeth and hurt his client's chances in the process? So the prosecution calls Officer Drake and they question him, and then Perry gets up. And he decides to not use the dentures, trying to tiptoe around it by having Officer Drake look at the crime scene photos and point out the trail of blood, which there isn't. And he's claiming that it's 40 feet of blood, but you don't see it anywhere. Perry then asks him who was the first arriving detective, and it was Detective Ennis. He asks him, "Do you think it's weird that Detective Ennis was the first one at that crime scene, the trolley car, and he was also the first one at George Gannon's suicide?" But the DA objects and the judge sustains. So Mason switches gears and asks, "Did you recover any pertinent evidence at the scene of the crime?" And Drake says no. And Mason does look down at the dentures, but decides once again not to use them and asks no further questions. Now, after court, he heads over to the church to look over their books. And when Elder Seidel walks in, he wants to know what the hell they're doing. And both Perry and Della claim that they had permission to do this, but Seidel says, "You don't have permission." Mason tells him to relax because they're actually trying to help the church in this situation. They're trying to prove that George Gannon was stealing from the church. They then ask him what this company was that just happened to be addressed to George Gannon's residence, and Seidel says, "Well, it's probably a subsidiary. We wouldn't be able to survive as a church if we were just going by donations, so we have a couple of companies." But Della says it's more like 50 to 60 companies. As Mason continues to question Seidel about some of the deeds, one of them being this account with the initials JH, Della steals one of the accounting ledgers, and after Seidel doesn't give him much information, the two end up leaving. Now that night, the district attorney, along with Detective Holcomb, get Detective Ennis and start going through pre-trial testimony, trying to coach him on his answers. But it kind of turns into them questioning Ennis more than coaching him, asking about the blood trail and the fact that he paid to be bumped up to be lead detective on the case. But Detective Ennis is having trouble answering the questions. And Holcomb says if you're having trouble answering these simple questions, then Mason is going to tear you apart on the stand. Ennis reassures him that he can handle whatever Mason's bringing him, but he's more concerned with the fact that is he actually there to practice, or is he there to be questioned by the district attorney and his partner? Either way, he does horrible in this practice, and the district attorney decides not to put him on the stand. That same night, Sister Alice approaches Bertie with a signed letter from Emily Dotson saying that they can dig up baby Charlie's body. We're only a couple days out from Easter Sunday, and the clock is ticking on this whole bringing baby Charlie back from the dead thing. Bertie tells her, you know she doesn't actually want you to do that. She's just placating you, right? She then tells Sister Alice how she's made other arrangements and then shows her a bunch of soup cases. And Sister Alice doesn't want to run, saying that if we can't do it, we can't do it, but I'm not going to run from it. Bertie lets her know that it's not just Elder Brown with his sign outside that want her to fail. There's a lot of people in the church that want her to fail. And because of that, they need to get the hell out of town now before they're embarrassed. But Sister Alice reminds Bertie that that church is hers. The success of the church is because of her, and she's not going anywhere. So if you want to run, go ahead. But I'm staying right here. And finally, the last story of that night is when Detective Drake goes to visit Perry at his office and thanks him for not going back on his word, but it gave him a lot of time to think. He tells Mason how his boss actually gave him a bonus for not really giving any information on the stand, and he's sick of it. He's sick of having to be a second-class citizen to white people, and how a white murderer can look down on him just because he's black. He wants to do the right thing, and he wants to help Emily Dodson. So he takes the dentures and puts it into an evidence box. And even though it's not completely legal, he tells Mason, half the time, people don't even look in these boxes anyway. And he wasn't kidding about his plan to actually help Emily. He knows the blowback that he can get, to the point where he actually sends his pregnant wife to go live with her aunt for the time being, just to be on the safe side. So the next day when the prosecution calls the coroner to testify, the coroner is talking about how baby Charlie was suffocated to death, how his eyes were sewn open after the fact, and they start passing around pictures of baby Charlie's dead body to the jurors, and they are looking very dismissively at Emily Dodson. Perry then gets up and asks the coroner to look at this piece of evidence, i.e. the dentures, but the district attorney claims he has no idea what he's talking about. He's unaware of it. The issue for the district attorney is Perry's claiming to get it from the box that the district attorney's office sent over to him. So the piece of evidence has to be allowed. And Perry asked the district attorney, do you recognize that? Is that from George Gannon's second autopsy with you? And this is the first time that the district attorney's hearing of this, as well as the judge, so they pull a sidebar, but Perry is speaking so loudly, saying how he knows that George Gannon was murdered, Emily Dodson couldn't have done it, that the judge gets pissed off and calls both of them into his chambers. He tells Perry that he's not going to allow a second autopsy after the body of George Gannon went missing from the original morgue, and he's not going to allow any conspiracy theories on the dentures. They're inadmissible. And even though Perry thinks this is complete bullshit, he unfortunately can't do anything about it. So he goes out in the hallway and waits for the trial to resume when Della comes up to him because she's had quite a busy day. She was looking through some of the subsidiaries of the church and she found an interesting one called Gerard Incorporated, whose CEO is Herman Baggerly, and it was signed off on by John Hicks, aka JH. And Hicks had signed off on a lot of these companies, which is one of the reasons they want to talk to him. And luckily, Della found out where he lived after he was able to procure 20 acres of land for $1, which is one hell of a deal for an accountant. But Perry can't go investigate it at the moment because he gets called back into court where the prosecution calls their final witness. It's that woman who was hired to look after Emily in jail. And the prosecution asks about the time that Sister Alice came to visit her and what the two discussed. And the woman testifies to the fact that Emily said how baby Charlie would still be alive if it wasn't for George, and how she killed her baby, completely twisting her words around, ignoring any context whatsoever. She then tells the jury how Sister Alice asked if she covered baby Charlie's face with a pillow, and Emily nodded. And Emily loses it in court, yelling at the woman how she's lying. But it is a terrible look for Emily, with the district attorney saying that not only did Emily kidnap her own child, she actually murdered her own child. So as Perry is trying to usher Emily out of the courthouse amidst all the reporters, they're asking him a bunch of questions, and he says, if you want a real story, go ask the district attorney why he didn't call his lead detective to the stand. But something catches Emily Dodson's eye, and it's a poster claiming that Charlie will be risen from the dead in a couple of days. So when she gets back in the car with Della, she says, it's all right. The district attorney is going to end up dropping the charges because Sister Alice is going to bring baby Charlie back from the dead, and how can you have murder charges if the baby's alive? That's how warped Emily's mind has become. Now, since he wasn't called to the stand, Ennis is just at home working on his car when Holcomb shows up, and Holcomb wants the truth. He tells Ennis, everybody knows that you're lying. How dirty are you? Did you kill those guys? Did you stitch that baby's eyes open? Ennis tells him, look, man, you're the one that got me into this. Shaking people down, the whorehouse. But Holcomb looks at him and says, you can't even compare the two things. So Ennis kind of comes clean and says he got hired to do a job and things didn't go as planned. And Holcomb asks him, who knows about this? Who can pin this on you? And it's not like Holcomb wants to do the right thing and talk to that person. No, he wants to know who can pin this on his partner because he wants to shut that person up. Now, while all of this hoopla was going on, Pete headed to Denver to look into the connection between Ennis and the kidnappers. But while going through some files, he doesn't find a connection between Ennis and the kidnappers. He finds a connection between the kidnappers and Elder Seidel, because Seidel was in charge of hiring the kidnappers to do a job back in Denver when he was in charge of this company, and it's just the lead that they were looking for. So he heads back to California to let Mason know of the good news. But Mason is heading to track down John Hicks, and he goes to his address, knocks on the door, and Hicks says, yeah, you're that woman's lawyer, right? I've been waiting for you to find me. But when he opens the door, he's holding a shotgun. Thank you for watching this recap. If you do not see the next one up in the corner right there on the end screen, don't worry, it'll be up shortly. Please consider following the channel. That'd be cool. If you liked the video, give it a thumbs up. And if you don't, there's a thumbs down button for a reason.